And welcome back to the Holy Hardwood with Pat and Tony. After extended holiday hiatus, the boys are back to discuss Pelicans basketball.
Welcome back, Pat. Welcome back is right. Last time we chatted, I think it was the night of the in-season tournament. So lots gone on with this Pelicans team coming into this game against the Memphis Grizzlies on a 4-0 record after that embarrassing loss to the Lakers. A lot of good to take away from this last week and a half stretch of going 4-0. But the ultimate test was tonight with the return of Ja Morant and this Memphis Grizzlies team, uh, which, Ja did his thing late, making that last second shot and ultimately propelling them over the New Orleans Pelicans tonight.
Yeah, and then welcome back, Tony. Happy to get together here, sit down and discuss this. I always think it's beneficial to step away and maybe just to absorb some of these games and um, maybe not be put into a position where you need to offer direct feedback at all times, right? You can really consume it and think on it and look at things as a whole. You touched on that 4 game stretch coming out of that. Um, you know, I think it's safe to say embarrassing loss in the in-season tournament. That in-season tournament game is behind us, but when you look at that 4 game stretch, they were put in a position where they did have a very favorable schedule. That's just throughout an 82 game schedule, you're gonna have ebbs and flows, right, in the schedule where you're gonna have stretches of games that are certainly more difficult than others, and this was on the softer side of that with those 4 games against teams that I think it's safe to say the Pels were the favorite coming into each one of those games. So it was good to see that despite having different guys on different nights step up, they found ways to compete and win and play different styles and ultimately take care of business and come into this game, like you said, coming in on a 4 game stretch and um, really saw them starting to make some headway there in the Western Conference as standings start to get tighter and tighter as we get deeper into this season. So certainly some positives there, but I think those games and the development we've seen over the last 4 games have really segued into this game tonight, right? Um, the Grizzlies come in being a team that we've had difficulties with in the past. They're a team that certainly when they're led by Ja Morant offer a unique challenge in terms of his athletic ability and his star power to really drive that team and really make those around him better and more efficient. And um, ultimately we knew it was going to be a tougher task when we went to Memphis, right? And they were without Ja, so we knew it was going to be a tough matchup coming in. And I think sitting here after this game, I think we both have some, pretty unique talking points on this, and maybe can both offer some different insight from different perspectives when looking at this loss against the Grizzlies.
No question about that, Pat. I'll kind of let you take over from here a little bit just because I think you have some more insight about the game on kind of seeing it, in full effect, seeing it from start to finish, where I kind of saw bits and pieces, but I'll comment on the bits and pieces that I did see, but I'll kind of let you take this away in whichever direction you want to take it. And if I have any feedback or anywhere to hop in here, I'll, hop in.
Sure, happy to go ahead and break this one down. Um, starting off, obviously, you knew this game was going to be unique in terms of it was a national TV game. It was against a conference rival, I would say, over the last couple of years in the Memphis Grizzlies, right? A team that we've had some pretty good matchups in the past, team that we match up favorably against, and they also have some guys on their roster that give us some fits as well. And then the added caveat on top of that was the return of Ja Morant after that 25 game suspension, being handed down from the NBA in the offseason. Um, People were questioning whether or not he would come in looking very sharp and would play, extended amount of minutes as he typically would if he wasn't coming off of a extended suspension like he was. And I think those questions were answered pretty quickly. You saw him in the first quarter come out very aggressive, looking to get to his spots, pick up the pace, um, play with a lot of tempo, and really start to make things easier on guys like Jaren Jackson and Desmond Bain, who although didn't have a great shooting night, you could see that he already was, getting some pressure relieved on him by just having Ja Morant sharing the backcourt with him once again. So, um, in terms of um, the impact it would have on the Memphis Grizzlies, I wasn't surprised. I figured it would be a tough game, dealing with the added energy and motivation and just all the different things that come to a team when they get a guy such as Jaws caliber back in the lineup, right? You knew they were going to get an influx of energy and they were going to be playing together and be playing motivated, as a unit, despite just Ja himself coming out with something to prove. And I think he did a good job of that. He changed a lot of things for the Grizzlies. He gave them that dynamic superstar that was able to put pressure on the rim and get into the paint all night and really caused our defenses fits. But that's something we're used to, especially based on our previous matchups on Ja. That's why when playing when healthy, he is one of the more impactful guys in the league. Just from a physical standpoint, right? He's so explosive and so athletic, that he causes a lot of pressure on your defenses and causes you to really be stressed, and you really do have to get to a place where you're gonna bend and not break, from a defensive standpoint. So, you know, first things first, I think hats off to them. They did a good job of coming into a place and battled all night, and especially, you got to give it up to Ja, right? Coming off a 25 game suspension, he had mentioned he hasn't played a real game of 5-on-5 in an NBA arena for close to 8 months, right? So you got to give him his credit where credit is due. He played a very good game, all things considered, and I think you saw that the Grizzlies really relied on that and really thrived off that, especially late.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of those points about Ja and the Grizzlies and kind of like what we did, but I don't know. It's just one of those things where you have a game like this and you start out like you did and it was a close game, then you kind of hit them in the mouth in the second quarter and build that 20 to 25 point lead. We say it all the time. Yes, these are NBA players and NBA teams. People blow those leads all the time, but you know, when you're the Pelicans, you really hope that you could have gotten this win, especially them coming on a back to back. Yes, they add Jaw, and a spark like that will be huge for a team. But once you kind of hit them in the mouth on the second night of a back to back, you should have came in that third quarter and really put the nail in the coffin there. And that was kind of really upsetting to see just from my vantage point.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. Like you said, these are NBA players, NBA teams, and runs are going to happen, and sometimes you're going to get or be on the losing side of that. But I think a lot of it is how you end up on the losing side if you happen to, and how frequently, right? There's going to be times where that's going to happen, but to really start to have a tendency or it becomes a characteristic of your team that when you get up 20, 25 points in a game, you suddenly feel less in control than you would be if it was a back and forth possession by possession game. I think it really shines light on some issues that this team is having on multiple fronts, right? That shouldn't be a scenario where if you do find yourself up 20 points late into a second quarter or coming into a second half, I mean, you should pretty much be in cruise control, and you're looking at getting guys extended rest and getting out of that game sooner than later with a win. And it just seems like this team really really struggles when they're put in a position like that. And I think there's a multitude of reasons that occurs. It's obviously a gift and a curse to have as many talented guys as the Pels do offensively, um, and especially a lot of guys that are, they can catch fire fast and they can fill it up very quickly when looking at guys such as Bi, CJ, Zion, and even a guy like Trey Murphy's late emergence here. Those are all great things to have, but I think you also have to be careful of the fact that their ability to score offensively and how explosive they can really be a blinding spot in terms of I think it covers up a lot of things that you're really not focusing on when you see them go on a run like that in that second quarter, right? Just because of how impactful they can be on the offensive end. And then I think what you end up seeing later in these games is as they're starting to cool off or the opposing team is taking things away, as they rightfully should, and you should expect that they're going to do. I think it starts exposing those one would call them warts that your team certainly has, and that's what I think we saw happen. I think they just went, when looking at Brandon and CJ's second quarter. I mean, those two guys went pretty nuclear, right? They were getting good shots every possession, and they were hitting a large portion of those. I know Brandon had a big second quarter. CJ at half was hitting 5 of 6 from three, which is great, right? But you can expect that there's going to be a regression or he's going to fall back to the norm at some point. And when that happens, it puts a lot of extra pressure on those weak points of your team in a game like tonight, right? You saw a Herb Jones who typically his bread and butter and his role on this team is to be a defensive stopper. And, usually you can chalk it up to having 4 or 5 defensive highlights a game that you can refer back to and say, do you remember when Herb got in this passing lane or he made this rotation and got a deflection or got a block, right? And this just wasn't one of those games for him. He really struggled keeping John in front of him and keeping him out of the paint and was kind of playing behind the ball for the extent of those possessions. And I think whenever Herb is put in a position like that, which are few and far between, right? He is one of the better defenders in the league, but on a night like tonight, when he's not impacting the game on a defensive basis, right? He doesn't have a ton of value on the floor, especially as those other guys really start getting it going and they look to getting those guys off the ball, as you saw later in the game with Brandon after he was, had really found a rhythm and is playing at a super high level. They were essentially taking the ball out of his hands, and we're not going to allow him to beat them. And that's where guys like Herb come into play. And this just was not a good game for Herb. He wasn't able to put pressure on the rim, attacking closeouts because they weren't closing out to him. They weren't respecting him as a perimeter shooter. They were living and dying by him catching and shooting, and ultimately that was a good decision by the Memphis Grizzlies because Herb wasn't able to make him pay. Um, so in terms of Herb's production, I think that is more of just a chalk it up to it was a bad night for him. It was a bad matchup. I don't think that's an overall theme with Herb. I think that's just one that you got to move on and accept that he just didn't have it tonight. But in those moments where a guy like Herb Jones doesn't have it, you got to be able to rely on some of those other guys that you should be able to pencil in every night to be very impactful. I do know that obviously coming into this game and kind of working off of that Lakers game, the in-season tournament, right, where 4 or 5 games removed, and it has been an up and down 4 or 5 games when looking at a guy like Zion's production, and he's certainly taken a lot of flack in the media, and I think a lot of that is rightfully so. He's put himself in that position to garner that negative attention and negative feedback. Um, but Zion also wasn't very good tonight, and I think that unfortunately, where I draw a lot of concern in terms of Zion's production and Zion's role on this team and his fit is I think ultimately you're seeing uh albeit small, it is a sample size and you're starting to see a trend of really the impact he can have on a game when you're playing teams of this magnitude and these teams are playing the style that they're playing, right? I think it's fair to say if you were watching that game from start to finish, that one had a little bit more of a end of season, postseason, play-in tournament type of feel rather than your typical Tuesday night 6:30 tip-off in New Orleans. And a lot of that comes from the energy of it being a nationally televised game. A guy like John Morant returning, right? There were a lot of eyes on this, and you just really saw Zion struggle, right? Um, he is an incredibly explosive player. He has the ability to be very impactful from night to night. But I think as you're seeing him work through this season, it's just he's so limited offensively that whenever he is, facing any team that has either a primary defender that can really disrupt him and keep him from getting to his spots initially, or even worse, a perimeter or a rim defending big such as Jaren Jackson, who has a lot of length and can, he can play vertically and use that length to deter him. It's just there's not a lot of other things that Zion can really turn to be impactful on a game like tonight. I mean, you look at he played 25 minutes, and that's all. That's considering the fact that he, dealt with very early foul trouble, which took him out of that first quarter. So, outside of that first quarter, he did play a large amount of minutes. He had as many opportunities as needed to work into that rhythm. And you didn't see him, really get it going tonight. I think it's pretty inexcusable for a guy of Zion's talent and a guy of Zion's usage when he's playing the right way to essentially, I believe he didn't even get to the free throw line tonight, and if so, it was one or two trips, nothing in terms of what we come to expect from an aggressive Zion Williamson. So that is concerning to me. I think that is something that is trending in the same direction. It seems like it's getting worse. It's getting harder for him to score and create offensive opportunities for this team as they're facing some of these more similar situations, like this game, like the play-in tournament, like some of the other play-in games or tournament games, in-season tournament games. I think we're starting to see a trend, and I think it's a trend that certainly needs to be discussed. And I think that as great as Zion is, at times it becomes very difficult to navigate because obviously you feel like Zion should be in the game, as big of a part of, that he is of this team and the role that he has on this team. But ultimately, I think it's not the best thing for this group as a whole to sometimes have him out there. And I think that him being out there and not being able to be impactful in a multitude of ways is really becoming debilitating at times for this unit.
Yeah, Pat. I mean, a lot of insightful things saying there. Um, I don't know. I just shake my head every time. It just seems like there's a big game feel, big time lights opportunity for Zion, and you just hate to say it, and you're rooting for the guy, but it just seems like he always kind of falls a little bit short in these moments, and it's just not a good thing to see. And there's confidence wise as a fan or as like a teammate, like you expect Zion in this game to put up his normal numbers, and for whatever reason it seems like when there's just a, oh, it's the big night Tuesday, national TV, now all eyes are on you, and whatever it may be, it just falls flat. What I love about this team is kind of going back to this last week or this 4 game stretch here. Zion played really big after that humiliating loss that the team had against the Lakers, came out, had his 36 points or whatnot. And then you saw the next game, I think Brandon had 40. And then the game after that, Jonas had 20, 25 to 29. And then CJ's turn on Sunday. But when in doubt, when these games get tougher and, like we said, have that big game feel, I mean, I know what I'm getting from 14 every time. The outlier of that Lakers game, yeah, he didn't play that well. No one played that well. But going into all these, even you saw Brandon struggle early just with his skill and how he can get to his spots and get into a rhythm like that. You just see how just talented that guy is. And it just, I don't know if it's a mentality thing with Zion or what's kind of stopping him from breaking through in these moments. But like you said, it's a hindrance because, if I'm coaching that group, say this game or in some games past, I mean, it's hard to say you take Zion off the floor, but you've seen it when you have a certain group out there of a CJ, Brandon, Trey, Herb, whatever combination you want to go. If you want JV on the floor or JV off the floor, you can put different people in there. The offense has more space. There's more opportunities for a Trey Murphy to get minutes, to get more shots, which then I think in turn tonight, you go with that starting group, which probably more than likely Taylor Jenkins said, we're not going to guard 3 of these guys out here late in the game. We're going to double BI, let them, blitz all those screens, and then he's going to have to pass it to the middle of the floor and have those guys make the decisions for him or make tough shots. Because Jaw was on Herb and not making any decisions of guarding him whatsoever. JV, they're going to live with whatever JV does if he rolls to the basket. And then with Zion, they know he can't shoot. So if you can kind of, wall him up at the free throw line, it becomes, like we saw CJ got those 2 shots and ultimately missed them at the end. But I think it just with Zion in here and some other like JV in these types of games, like I wish I would have saw Trey Murphy out there or a Dyson Daniels who played some limited minutes, but in those minutes was very successful. Maybe you switch a Zion and Herb and just see what you get from a Trey and a Dyson if you're still wanting to go with JV to get rebounds and whatever it may be. But I feel like in the long run, it's it's bad to say, but you've seen this team look really well with Zion off the floor in some of those key moments.
Yeah, and that's pretty well said. I mean, nothing that I would dispute there. If anything, I think there's two, I would say, main concerns or questions for this group moving forward. Looking at the rest of this year and being competitive, and then making some tough decisions down the road is, I think, first staying with the Zion question. I think I think it's safe to say there's always been areas of concern or deficiency in Zion's game, right? Even at his best, he's always had deficiency in terms of it was hard to get enough shooting around him because of his inability to space the floor or operate in any spaces other than the paint. I think he's also has a lot of concerns on the defensive end of the floor. And I think, when he was playing at the highest of his powers and the peak of his game, I think he was so dominant on the offensive end on the interior that it was you were able to offset some of it and you were able to live with some of the deficiencies because he was playing at an otherworldly level. I mean, you had made the comment earlier, right? You expect Zion in a game like tonight to get his number. Well, those numbers themselves have diminished, right? Even the own expectations that we have are not the same. We're not asking Zion to give us 27 and 8, right? That has come down a level. He's not the same player as he was when he was at 27 points a game, 8 rebound guy. He's a 21 to 22 point a game, 5 rebound guy at this point. Now, do we ever see him get back to that? I can't answer that now. Only really he knows that, and only the future will show us that. But I, I think his ceiling has come down a bit to where now he's closer to that floor and some of those concerns that we have with him. Where now it's time to have some actual conversations where is his impact on the floor and the style that we have to play with him on the floor, is that advantageous to us considering all the deficiencies that we have while he is on the floor? I think you stated it and made a good point, right? We saw units over the last 4 or 5 games after Trey's return where you saw Brandon and CJ and JV, and then pick whoever your auxiliary piece is, whether it's a Herb, a Dyson, a Jose, right? You saw those guys playing next to a guy like or a guy like Trey, who is trending in the right direction, whose game is built for the modern era of the NBA, right? He is a guy that analytics should love. He's either a guy that's going to dunk the basketball or he's going to guy that's going to shoot a three, right? Which is a good fit um, in retrospect to when looking at guys like Brandon and CJ that certainly have mid-range capabilities, although their games have expanded and have become more versatile. But his game does fit very well next to them, and his game makes those other guys' life a lot easier. I'm not sure that even when I see Zion playing his best version of himself, right, in a statistical manner, games that you think he has 29, 30, 31, and would fall into the category of being a good Zion game, I don't really see those games as being easier for the other guys. It's just Zion's got it going, and everyone else kind of just knows get the ball to Zion. But his gravity and the way that he plays and the spaces that he operates in, I don't think makes it easier for the rest of those guys. I mean, really, if you had to, you know, assess the 4 main guys or 5 main guys that this team depends on an offensive basis, looking at Brandon, Zion, CJ, JV, and Trey, Zion's game is the one that's the least built for this modern type of game, and is the one that is the hardest, form of offense that I think to remain sustainable and to continue to build around and is easier for other guys to play around. Just because it is so limited, it's boom or bust for him, and I think that's the concern, right? All those other guys have the ability to impact the game on an offensive basis on different levels of the floor, right? You see a game like tonight, like that wasn't that was a masterclass from a guy like Brandon, right? I mean, he, like you said, started slow, but was getting good looks, and they were good misses, right? And you knew inevitably based on his track record, he was going to find a way to even that out. And he went well and above that and had one of his best games of the year, if not his best game of the year, right? Um, did a really good job of getting to the free throw line, playing around the rim. He used his shot fakes really well. He was making guys pay by when he was allowed to get to his spot. He was doing a great job of finding his teammates in transition and working out of double teams. And I mean, you can say whatever you want to say about Brandon, but at the end of the day, he did the right thing. He played to a level that demanded the Grizzlies to run a double team at him, which ultimately makes his teammates' life easier on the floor. And he did the right thing. He drew two and he kicked it to the next guy and relied on his teammates to make a play. And tonight they weren't able to do that. That is concerning to me because there should be no scenario if you have Zion, Brandon, and CJ on the floor. If Brandon draws two, and you're going to have to respect CJ, there's no world where Zion should not be able to be impactful, right? Like just mathematically, in the amount of defenders that are on the floor, they shouldn't be able to stop him as easily as they are. And you're seeing he's struggling against length, and he's struggling to get to his spots, and he's struggling to explode around the rim. And I just think that that's just where we're at right now. And I think this year you're going to have to face that because Trey Murphy is coming. You know, the direction he's heading in and the way that his game is fits the rest of this roster and fits the modern game. You have got to give him minutes and you've got to put him in a position to win. And if not, you're doing this organization, this franchise, and his teammates a disservice because of the abilities he has on the floor. And there's often been conversations of, well, somebody's got to go, but it's hard not to think that Zion might, in some way, have to be the one that takes a back seat because those other guys have other skills that translate later in the year and are skill sets that you can't replace. And those skill sets are maximized by Trey as well. Like they mend well together. I'm never going to be a guy that says let's go smaller, right? I'm never going to say let's get rid of Brandon with his length and his versatility and Herb's length and athleticism to get Trey in there, right? I'm going to want to get as long and as athletic and as rangy as possible. And unfortunately, it's starting to look more and more like Zion might be that odd guy out. Now, if that ever happens, we'll have to see. But I think that you're at least getting enough data at this point to say Trey needs to have a larger role on this team. Not saying he's taking the mantle from any of those other. I think those three guys of CJ, Brandon, and Trey work really well together, and they'll figure it out because their games don't really step on each other's toes. Um, but Zion's the oddball right now. He's either gonna sink or swim. He's either gonna figure it out and get back to what he's doing. And I think then the problem kind of takes care of itself. But if it doesn't, and we continue to get kind of this sporadic up and down nature of his performances, then I think we're gonna have to have some pretty tough conversations.
Yeah, and just to go off of that, it just, all stars in this league, there's a ceiling of the amount of points or shots they can hit. And you can go down the list of, yeah, this guy averages this many points, this many points, this many points. But at the end of the day, like, it's because they're getting those, anywhere between 6 to 12 free throws a night. And you see on the lesser nights or the bad nights for Zion, he cannot get to the free throw line. And I don't know if that's just game to game, it's being called differently, in these bigger type atmosphere games, like we've been saying. Like, if they're not willing to give Zion the calls, he's going to have to force them to make those calls. He has to play with force and that ability at the rim. And, I get it. I'm sure he's getting fouled on some of those. But like you're saying, to have one or two trips at the line, 13 points, like that just can't happen in a game like this. You see his really, really good games, he's getting 10 to 15 free throws or whatever the number is. And that's when he's getting his 25 to 35 points in those outings. In the bad games where he's, 17 or below, he's getting one, two, three, four. And I think that's just the difference. You see a Brandon Ingram on most nights, he probably scores a legitimate 20 to 24 points strictly on mid-range layups, threes, and he'll get his few free throws here or there. On
Yeah,
the
and the nights that he does get those, that's where you see monster games where he's able to put up, 33, 34, and even looking at that 40-point game. I mean, he, you know what you're going to get from him night in, night out in terms
Mhm.
of scripting him shots, and he's going to give you a very high percentage of making a lot of those shots. Um, it's just with Zion, a lot of it is dedicated with. I just don't know which. I think some of it is physical limitations. I think a part of it is skill limitations. He just doesn't have a lot of things he can go to keep defenses guessing and to be versatile, right? That's one of the things that makes Brandon one of the hardest covers in the league, besides being 6'8", 6'9", being very strong. You don't know what he's going to do. You don't know if he's going to go left, he's going to go right, he's going to pull up off one or two dribbles, or he's going to fade away, or he's going to ball fake, get you up in the air, get to the free throw line, or get to the front of the rim, or you go under. Like it's you're constantly being defensive as a defender because he has so many different facets of his offensive game that he can go to that it naturally puts you in a defensive aspect as a defender, and you can't be as aggressive when a guy is limited offensively and he has one or two things that's the only thing he can go to. It becomes a lot easier to sit on one of those hands and just wait for him to come into you, and that guy's coming behind you. You're just limited, and I think some of the regression athletically has put a lot more pressure on that, and he has not, to this point, developed his game or added to his game to offset some of those deficiencies athletically, right? And that's natural. The guys in the league constantly are facing issues where they decline athletically. Prime example, look at LeBron from 4 or 5 games ago. I mean, he was the best athlete on the planet at his prime, and he's clearly had a decline athletically, but he's continued to add to his game. Right, he's more talented than ever when he's operating in that low post or mid range area. He's shooting a higher clip from the 3 point line. Like he's even adding to his game, and he's arguably one of the best players of all time. I mean, if anybody doesn't need to continue working on their game and continue to rounding out their tool bag of things they can go to, it's a guy like LeBron. And then in retrospect, you have a guy like Zion that really hasn't done anything, hasn't been available, and has had more than enough time to add to his game. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that. And I think the more or the longer this season goes on, and the harder these games get, and the opponents are only going to get better and better and better, and more prepared and more prepared and more prepared, it's going to be tough for him. It's going to be incredibly tough because guys are not just going to allow him to just run him over and get to the free throw line or get to the rim. Like they're not going to happen. And I think if you're assuming that it is, I think you've got to be honest with yourself and ask yourself, have you seen that in the past decade, 2 decades? That's just not how the game is played in the postseason. Um, and I think that's a real problem. Um, but again, a lot of it also starts with this wasn't a game that we were getting a lot of effort from Zion, right? Some of those games that we've seen him have bigger nights, he's been impactful on the offensive glass. He's getting some of those putback rebounds where he's getting it a foot from the rim and can go straight up and play through contact and get to free throw line. He wasn't doing that tonight. Tonight was a more of one of those games like Sacramento or LA where he was just floating around, didn't really seem to be in a rhythm. And you'll often hear people say, "Well, we've got to get him involved." But also getting him involved in the way that you need to get him involved also makes it more difficult for everybody else. Um, because there's only so many ways you can get him involved, and it looks the same, and it's a lot of standing and watching and hoping he can get to the rim and make some tough acrobatic shots around the rim over length. So I think there's certainly a Zion concern, but on to my second point, I think that tonight was, um, you know, I don't want to have recency bias, but tonight was one of Willie's worst games from a coaching aspect. Um, I think he probably in totality coached from 1 to 48 a pretty terrible game. I think you just had some incredible offensive display and Brandon and CJ that really um, hit a lot of that early in this game. We didn't do anything late in that game or late in that second half as they were making a run to get the ball out of John Morant's hands. We didn't run a double team at him. We didn't force other guys to beat us. Um, we had some very, very weird rotations in terms of um, Trey play. I would love to see the stat on how many minutes Trey played in the first half, but I know for sure he didn't play very many in the second half, especially when we needed him to space the floor and make Memphis pay for running that double at Brandon late. So I think there's some serious, coaching questions that we have to ask Willie. He's had some of these games where it's just it's at a point where you really question, like, what was the thinking here, and how did we get to these decisions? Because it just doesn't make sense, right? Even guys that maybe don't follow the game as closely as others would consider, later in that game when you need spacing and you need guys to hit shots, you should have your highest percentage shooter on the floor, and it's not like you're making up a huge sacrifice because your best shooter's 6'1" and very like I mean he's 6'10", long, athletic. Like if you can't make that work, I don't know what you're gonna be able to make work. It's just a very discouraging game in terms of that. Um and it's just a problem. I think we just got confirmation. He played about 6.5 minutes in that second half, and that's just that's inexcusable. I mean, looking down the pipeline, that's a guy that you're going to be building around and spending a lot of money to keep within this organization, and rightfully so, based on his growth. Right? It's just I have a hard time understanding how a guy like Trey Murphy with his skill set in a game like this only gets 6 minutes in the second half. In comparison to a guy like Najee Marshall who's getting 9 minutes. Although Najee's been good, but he's not a Trey Murphy and can't offer that level of support that Trey can to those other guys. So I think that's a big concern of mine. In terms of that, and I think I think he's got to make a conscious decision that I know defense is certainly his calling card. That's what Willie has leaned on and how he's decided to, you know, allocate minutes to guys. But at some point, I think you have to understand that you have the keys to an offensive juggernaut. And that's going to be the thing that ultimately, if you get to where you want to get to at the end of the year, I don't think it's because this team's going to be a top three team defensively. I think if this team gets to a Western Conference Finals, everything falls right. They end up making a finals. It's going to be because they have so much offensive firepower that it becomes too much. I think I heard it in the pregame. I think New Orleans still to this point is the only team in the league that has three guys averaging 20 points a game. Um, they have three very high level offensive players. They have a guy like Trey that can fill it up in absolute bunches. You have a guy like Hawk who's coming off the bench that when he has had opportunities, is you've seen that he can be ignited and he can be incredibly explosive. This isn't a team that I envision winning games scoring 105 points a game. This is a team that when you look deep into the Western Conference is scoring 125, 130 points, and they're running people out of the gym because teams can't keep up with them offensively. And I think sooner than later, you have got to lean into that. And if you aren't willing to lean into that, then I don't think you're the right guy for this job because you're wasting away what this team has that differentiates itself from other teams in the league. There's a lot of other teams that can sit down and guard, which is what we're trying to do, but there's not a lot of teams that can match our firepower on night in, night out basis in terms of our three high level guys and the way that they can really, really disrupt a game from the areas that they operate in. And then guys like Trey, who, up until this point, has shown that he can be one of those guys that fill it up from three as quickly um, as any guy in the league, let alone probably Steph Curry is probably the only guy ahead of him that I would say fills it up at a quicker rate. So um, that's really my two main takeaways. Obviously, you got to move on from it and hopefully find a way to correct those wrongs and get back on the winning streak. Right, you let one slip away, now go get on another 4 game winning streak and figure it out. But we need to see a better Zion, and if we're not going to see a better Zion, we need to start, making some tough decisions and having some tough conversations. And more importantly, I think it's time for Willie to set a little bit of his own self aside, and I think we've really got to lean into um, our offensive guys, focusing on that end of the floor, right? You're always going to have guys like Herb and Dyson and Najee and Jose that can be in there with those groups to give you a little bit of defensive versatility and toughness. But this is not a team that's going to be, the 2004 Detroit Pistons. This is going to be a team that's going to be the Golden State Warriors or the Thunder, the team that just overpowers you offensively. And I think you've got to lean into it at this point.
Yeah, like you said, Pat, there's just too many talented guys offensively on this team. And like I've always said before, is, you know, the more you can get that middle of the lane open for a Brandon or a CJ to get in there and to operate, and, you know, it's the classic, paint great, get in the paint, kick out to all your shooters. I mean, just imagine a lineup with, Brandon, CJ, Trey, Hawkins, and if you want Zion to be that guy, or Herb or whoever it may be, like it becomes a mathematical game. You get into the middle and you're playing 3-on-2 basketball from there, and those other two guys besides the guy in the middle who's making those decisions are probably 40% free throw or 3-point shooters, and it just becomes a mathematical equation at that point. And like you said, you just got to lean into that and make teams pay, and that's what will make teams actually guard you offensively. I mean, you're going to be putting them in hell if that's the case. And I don't know how you do it, but you got to give those guys like Trey and even Jordan just more opportunity, because he's been kind of dug in on that bench. And granted, I get it, we're a healthy team, and you can't play everybody, but sometimes you do have to switch here or there and say, hey, like, we're looking big picture now, and this is what ultimately we will make this team better in the long run this year and years to come. Because when you think of it, I mean, I pretty much know in my head what guys are here and what guys aren't and could be movable pieces. But, I think you got to lean into it that way and go with those guys.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think, one thing that popped into my head as you said that is, I'm sitting here asking myself this question is, you know, you're sitting there saying, if Trey's out there on the floor and you have the shooting and you're opening up the lane, which has often been the complaint with Zion is he hasn't had the ability to play in space because of that shooting. But I got to ask myself this question: is if that paint is open and you're playing with a guy like Trey Murphy on the floor, and that mid range area and the paint is not as occupied because of that, I think there's an honest question to be asked: is who is the better offensive player if that's the case? Personally, I think Brandon is a better offensive player in that scenario. If Brandon's able to operate now freely in the paint and gets to the free throw line 10 times a night, I think his ceiling becomes way higher. And that's where you see him take that level of being a 27, 28, 29 point per game scorer because he has every other aspect of the game. If you're putting shooters around him and truly opening up that lane, I think he's shown this year, especially, he is very effective at playing in the paint and playing around the rim. And you've seen games that he gets to the free throw line 8 to 10 times a night. It's almost 35. It's 32, 33, 35, 37, 40. Like, he is a very explosive offensive player when you do that. And I think the question has always been, oh, well, if you open up the space for Zion, yes. But I think you just get the same version of Zion, just slightly better. But you're not gaining anything by doing that. You might get Zion who gets two or three extra um, open looks at the rim, but again, he's also just playing. He's only making twos, right? There's a cap to it. So I think not only does stretching the floor out and giving those minutes to Trey and accepting that Trey needs to be on the floor, those other guys to play off of. I think you get the best version of Brandon out of that, and I think that ultimately, I think we've always had this conversation that Zion needed that to maximize everything, and we would get the best version of that. But I think you would see even another level of Brandon being unlocked because you're seeing that night in, night out. As crazy as it is, him at age 26 and being I guess you could consider a vet in this league, he's still expanding his game. He's still getting better and better and better. And the game is slowing down, and you're seeing him adapt different things to his game. And like we said, he's playing at a very high level around the rim. He's finishing very well. And I know for a fact that if he was not getting as many guys sitting in the paint and sitting on top of him, helping off of Zion in the short corner or the free throw line extended, I mean, he would be even tougher to stop. So um, I think that's a true conversation, right? There's always been can you really get rid of Zion because is Brandon good enough or have a high enough ceiling to truly be a number one? And I don't think you can answer that yet. But I think it's also fair that I think there's another level that he could and would go to if he had that amount of spacing on a night in, night out basis. Because right now he's operating with not much space next to Zion, due to the duo, and he's really maximizing it pretty much every night. So
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying it for a couple weeks, couple games. We talk, off of podcasts, and I've always been under the impression that the team looks a whole lot better, unfortunately, when Zion is out of the lineup and when Trey has been put into that position, still coming off the bench. I mean, you take the Wizards game last week. Yeah, it's the Wizards, but that team was humming offensively. I mean, there's no joke that they score 142 points and Trey looks the way he does and gets the open shots he does. Like we said, I mean, if Brandon gets an open middle of the space, he's a good enough passer and a willing enough passer to get it to a JV, get it to Trey, get it to all these guys around the
He's a
horn.
better passer than Zion. I mean, Zion's a good
No
passer,
doubt, no
but
doubt.
Brandon is a better passer and a better playmaker out of that middle section of the floor, as he should be. He's
Hmm.
bigger, he's longer, he has characteristics that should make him a better passer in terms of his size and length. So I don't think it's a surprise there. But he's also not limited to the fact that it's either a pass or a lay. Like
Hmm.
there's a different level of it, and I think you have to be either have played the game at a high level or defend. Like you have to understand how much pressure that puts on you as a primary defender and the pressure it puts on you as an off-ball defender, knowing how good of an offensive player he is. I would be curious if you asked any other team in the league which guy they would adopt onto that team to make a run. I would imagine 90% of the league would pick Brandon over Zion. Other top guys in the league, right? If you're looking at the LeBron, the AD, like I think other teams understand that his impact and his versatility and his offensive ability is something that is more valuable than the way that Zion currently plays the game of basketball. And I don't think you can pretend that you can keep kicking the can down the road forever because at some point something's got to give. And I think you've been put in a position where CJ's played well enough this year that you can't responsibly take him out. He has earned a spot. Like he has done a good job of sliding down. He has been that auxiliary player next to whoever's got it going on. He's been efficient. He's been available. He has done everything that you've asked him to do. And I don't think that you can keep ignoring the fact that Trey is coming up the pipeline. Like Trey is coming. You are going to pay Trey. That is not a discussion. He is going to be one of your cornerstones of the franchise as he rightfully should. Somebody's got to go. And I think the more you just ignore it and hope that it's not the case, I think you've got to be honest with yourself. I think Zion is the odd man out. And now, do I know if you can salvage anything for him at this point and get whatever it is? I don't know that. I haven't spent enough time thinking about it, looking around the league. But to assume that you're just going to keep doing what you do and you're just going to keep rolling Trey off the bench, well, Willie's not going to have a job if he keeps doing what he's doing. He has got to lean into Trey because Trey gives them the best chance to win, helping those two other guys on a night in, night out basis. And yes, one out of every 6 or 7 games, you will get and see the flash of Zion, but you can't rely on it. I can't rely on it come March, April, May. I just can't rely on it 7 game series of a team scouting him and getting and making him score over the top and play other forms of the game. I just can't rely on it. And I think it's a decision that has to be made sooner than later.
Yeah, and all those are very, very valid points. And to go along with what we've been saying with the spacing and the tray, and there's no questioning that this team even plays faster. And I think that's the holdup too, is they can't, when Zion's in the lineup, play fast enough and get into their offense, which then makes them play in the half court. And that's where I see, like tonight, if you're not going to call a timeout late in the game, like what are you expecting? They're not a good half court team when a team can set up their defense. And when you've seen the games that he's been out and the offense has those guys on the floor, they get stops, get the rebound, and they go. There's no like thinking about anything. It's just boom, boom, boom. Brandon here using the screen, middle of the floor, kick out to Trey, three. CJ, same thing. And there's no offense that has to just be like, okay, let's pull it out, let's do this, let's think about. It's like no, but then it's when Zion's in there, he's trailing behind. We can't get into an offense. Then we have to hit high ball screens, get into an action. The middle's cluttered. Now you're kicking it out with 4 seconds left on the shot clock with a terrible shot, and boom, that's what loses you a game like tonight.
Well, I don't think there's any question about it. I think for some reason we've always been sold this bag of goods that it's super easy to play around Zion and you just kind of give him the ball and just go like that's just not realistic. Like even when you look and compare putting Brandon at the middle of the floor, and I think if you rewatch tonight's game and really watch him operate, it's way more natural for him and the rest of the team to have him play out of the middle of the floor and draw two and make decisions out of there than it is with Zion. It's just it all comes back to one thing. He is just too limited to be that impactful night in, night out at this level. It's just you can't be that way. You can't be 6'6" and try to be explosive with no other amount of your game. And it's not like the only like he gets compared to Giannis. Well, it only works because Giannis is 6'11". That's a massive difference than being 6'6". Giannis is bigger than whoever that secondary defender is that's coming over.
with a wingspan.
Yeah, Zion is smaller most of the time than the guy that's guarding him, and certainly smaller than the guy that's behind him protecting the rim. It's not sustainable, right? Like the very best version that Zion was ever going to be was if he was going to be a guy that almost like slimmed down and truly became a wing, right? A slashing wing that could play with his explosion at 6'6", 6'7". Him being a back to the basket, like isolate the one side, play at the free throw line, power forward is not the way to win in 2023, especially when you got those other guys in the pipeline. Like it's just it's too late, right? It's just it's not a way that they're going to be able to win. To get him involved, they have to slow it down way too much, which really makes the life harder on the rest of those guys that you want to make it easier for. Guys like Hawkins, Trey, CJ, even Bi. If you look at tonight, whenever he's got it going and they're playing with pace, he even clicks it up a notch and he starts playing at a higher pace and he even plays at a better level. Now, does Bi want to operate at 110 miles an hour all the time? No, but it's good because he can shift speeds. He can slow the game down possession by possession, and he can also kick it up 2 or 3 gears, and he can play in transition and play in semi-transition. And Zion just can't do that. Zion is all 0 to 60, but his 60 is not full speed. Like we've got to slow it down, pass it down to the block, and let him just do his thing and hopefully get to the free throw line or be able to finish at the rim. And I think it exasperates the rest of the group because it's not this unguardable offense that it's been like slotted to be, where like all we've ever heard is, oh well, if you just give the ball to Zion and put 2 or 3 shooters around him, it's unguardable. I don't think that's not true in a large sample size. If you give me 2 games with a 6-minute stretch, sure, that can be very impactful. But you can't do that for 82 games and get to where you want to be. And you certainly can't do it in a 7-game series when you have to win in the playoffs. Will never happen. Ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, we've said everything and all that, and those two main points of just kind of the Zion and the Willie thing and making tough decisions. I mean, but that's why you're in that position. At a certain point, you got to say, hey, this is this decision we have to do, and if it hurts some feelings, you're just going to have to hurt some feelings. Is it? Oh yeah, we all talk about wanting to win, but then when it impacts your minutes or your playing time, like how are you going to respond? Because my view is you totally lean in to Trey, Hawkins, and Dyson. And yes, Jose and Najee have given you good minutes and good stretches here in the season. But like I was saying before, the three guys that are probably moving along with your other guys in the franchise are probably Dyson, Trey, and Hawkins at this moment. And that's just my view on it. That's just one particular thing. But if I'm looking big picture here with your Brandon going forward, CJ's getting older. You hope someone slides into kind of like that role, and we got a Trey. Herb's going to be here. You don't know about JV and Jose and Najee moving forward, but I think those other three guys, if you're not building up now, then why do you have them here? Why do you have the Dysons playing, 15 minutes a night and producing, and then not even playing Hawkins at all when in the playoffs those are perfect assets to have? And so if you're just diminishing all these minutes and their playing time, how do you expect them to come perform at that level when it's like, oh crap, it's game 4 in the playoffs,
Well,
let's throw Hawkins in there?
well, it doesn't. That's the point. You're answering your question. It doesn't make any sense, and that's the concern. It's he Willie is going to fall back on what he knows, what he did as a player, and what he's comfortable with. He's going to rely and risk his job on guys that he knows are going to play hard and defend, and that's good to a certain point. But you can't reach your apex by playing that way. It's just not feasible. It's not how the game is played. The game is won on the offensive end of the floor. by teams that can create the most amount of mismatches and create the highest shot value in terms of good looks. You already have a guy that is um, almost borderline, and the numbers will suggest it. He's almost a cheat code offensively in terms of generating good looks, despite whatever the defense is doing. In Brandon, he is going to get you a good look regardless of what happens. Now, if he makes it or misses it, you don't know what's going to happen, but it's a relatively good look in terms of it. He's in the same cloth as a guy like Kevin Durant, as a guy like Devin Booker, who has had great, runs here in the postseason the last year or two. Like that's what he does, and that's a great. And you'll hear almost everybody say it on telecast, and guys that really know the game. But for some reason, you get a segment of the fan base and the crowd that really wants to harp on it and talk like that's the issue. It's not. It's a great thing to have. This team and this front office knows how valuable his skill set is, and that you need to have his skill set at the highest level. You also have a guy like Trey that gives you the ability to stretch the floor and get ridiculously hot and fill it up and be the great equalizer from the perimeter. So you have these two components offensively that you have in place. Now you've got to figure out the rest of it, and you've got to lean into offense. There's just no other way around it. There's always going to be a place for a Herb, for a Dyson, for a Jose to be that, but you can't build the entire rotation and your identity over we're going to be this hard nosed, play at 100 points, 105 points defensive team because it's just not going to happen. You have too good of offensive talent to play that style. Like no matter how much they buy in, Brandon Ingram knows he's an offensive weapon. CJ knows he's an offensive weapon. So if you're not putting them in a position that you're going to play to their strengths, then you're doing them a disservice. So lean into the offense, play. You can still be better than the other team defensively. Just score 140 points while you do it. Keep them to 130. You score 140, you still win. That's all that matters. But trying to beat teams and holding them to 96 points in 2023 is not going to happen. It's just not.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has just been a good way to get a few things off our chest, and it's to that point in the year where we've seen enough from certain guys or certain groups, and seen these guys in certain games, and at this point, you got to either lean into what you're doing now, and honestly, I don't think that's the right decision, or you do kind of a 180 or a 360, and you get the necessary guys on the floor that need to be on the floor in the allotted minutes to be successful. And that's kind of where you're at this point. And I'm okay living with that. If that fails, I'm 100% okay living with that and eating that words. But I am not okay with how it is now moving forward for another 55 games and then seeing it crumble in the playoffs like we know it's gonna be.
Pretty good. It's a pretty good spot to end on. So hopefully we can learn from it and we can go ahead and make some strides in the right direction. And hopefully some of these things, are being seen and thought about by others who have control of the situation. And hopefully we come out on the better end of it. So with that, I appreciate everybody tuning in. Thank you, Tony, for hopping on and talking about this one. This has been the Holy Hardwood with Pat and Tony.